it's in a helpful and discomforting way. Uh, and I so it's just and it I think it exposes a lot of the problems of I've wrestled with in ministry, and a lot of the things that bedevil congregations that I have worked with and been a part of is we just feel like we have to be doing more and better all the time. And I just worked with a couple congregations, including some where I was a pastor, where they'd be having some sort of fund drive, to rehab a building or build a building or something like that. And they would always want to have a chunk of the bucks set aside for, they said, for something uh, for you know, they consider what they were raising money was for us, and they wanted to do something kind of like a guilt and sin offering for others. And I would always say, well, I think your ecclesiology is messed up if you think the church is for you exclusively. But anyhow, so it just seems like that's been a framework of works righteousness, Pelagianism. We've talked about that many times before. That one gets socialized into, and until that stopped working for me, I was probably a pretty good advocate for it and practitioner of it.
It I think a lot, or often I think about um an op-ed that the historian Tom Holland wrote during COVID, scolding clergy for sounding like middle managers in health work.
Ah, right.
And
Yep.
spending more time about, like, dispensing rules about sanitation and washing hands than proclaiming a hope at the end of the pandemic.
Yeah, and
Um,
we're so happy to do all those little uh, fussy things. Uh,
yeah, and 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 so so Tom Holland's op-ed was, that um, Christians, the clergy in particular, misunderstand their role if they think of themselves as part of the helping profession.
yeah,
And what I like about Capon's The Mystery of Christ is it's sort of a diorama of that point.
yeah, 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 and he talks explicitly about that in his second chapter. I don't know if we're
Hmm.
addressing any of the reading tonight or not, but I think I've seen that so frequently that people feel like they're really therapists, or they should be therapists as clergy, and if they uh, but the problem is they substitute. There's nothing wrong with therapy per se, but they never get around to proclaiming the mystery of faith or the good news of the gospel. Yeah, we don't have confidence in that.
Yeah, so this book and then my friend Ken Jones in Iowa are the two people that cured me of CPE, clinical pastoral education.
Right. Yeah.
And for folks who don't know what CPE is, it's mandated chaplaincy training. At least it's mandated in the United Methodist Church. I'm sure it is in a lot of other mainline denominations as well. Um, but it's a secular form of chaplaincy training,
Yeah.
where you are quickly um, given the signs and indications that in order to succeed and jump through the hoops, you have to be as generic and bland about your faith, and in no way impose uh, it upon others, especially in the form of, like, giving them a promise to hold on to. And so CPE, I think, it's a way of rooting out potentially disastrous pastors, but it also, I think, turns other pastors into what Herawas calls, you know, quivering masses of availability.
Yeah.
Just, you
Yeah.
know,
The upside of I never had CP. I'm too old. I got in under the bar, and but the upside of it, as I've heard people talk about it, is you do get some feedback that might amp up your self-awareness a little bit, which is I, I would say I and many clergy could use. But you're right. It the least common denominator in terms of faith,
yeah.
theology,
Yeah.
gospel.
So, and it was helpful in exposing me to people's trauma, to trauma of people that I didn't know and love. So
Yeah.
it was a helpful kind of throw you in the deep end experience. But all of that to say that the way Capon arranges this book was an epiphany for me, since that's the season we're in. It was an epiphany to me to see that um, pastoral counseling and pastoral conversations are an opportunity to proclaim the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right.
So
And
as a
so,
therapist,
yeah, I was just about to pivot to you. And so Marty, when Tony suggested this book, I was like, well, I don't know how Marty's gonna feel about this book, because admittedly, the conversations that he frames the alternate chapters around, um, they are, you know, they are a plot device, and somewhat contrived. And so I was wondering how you reacted.
so the nature of traditional psychology works with the individual with their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and the diagnostic manual has identified disorders in these realms that all begin with the individual. So the nature of what we might call a theological therapy is what Capon does. That is the nature of what we might call health, which I use the word intimacy for that, to be in Christ, to be living by the Spirit, to recognize all those things that separate us from Christ and one another, to see yourself as persons in relationship that break down because we put people in boxes and lose the mystery of the other. We lose the mystery of Christ. We even lose the mystery of who we are. And so to function as a theologian who does therapy is to bring people into a world where relationships matter and your self-help doesn't. That it's the rabbit hole that has no end and no help in it. And so to say the nature of what Capon is doing as introducing us to Christ as one who comes at some level as a healer. But the nature of his healing is to recognize that performance, self-help, trying to earn anything is never a therapeutic agenda to get to where we need to be. So to say when we live honestly with God, ourselves, and others, there's a profound sense of mystery in that. It's just you're living in the present, you're open and honest. When you have to start hiding that, which Capon kind of sees that people fear being found out, they fear the consequences. Once you have one lie in place, then you have to start protecting it. You have to always make sure you don't betray yourself. And with each thing that you put in place with that, which may just be withholding, telling people who you are, what you feel, you have to keep protecting it, and it becomes a prison. And so there's no mystery in prisons. You're just locked in. You can't be honest. You can't be open. And if you think God is just watching everything, you lie about God and God's judgment of you, God will simply become your prison. Capon is the ultimate prison breaker. His therapeutic work is to allow us to see there is no prison. Quit living these lies. Quit conforming to the nature of the judgment of being a healthy individual as though that's achievable by oneself, and come into the light. Be open, be honest. And so to say, Capon is a therapeutic thinker out of the nature of the God who heals. Christ the healer, he is the great therapist, but he doesn't do it individually. He always does things in relation to others. So to say even the nature of education, where we think of three domains of learning that ultimately will give us success in the world, the domain of our thinking, the domain of our feeling, the domain of our skills, we haven't recognized there is a domain of relationship, and that we grow mostly in our relationship to one another. If we grow with God, that is the most deep and profound sense of discovering the wholeness of who we are. And there are skills in doing that. If you are cut off from growing in relationship with God, Karl Barth's going to just talk about that as sin. And I think Capon basically follows that. You've just cut yourself off from the one who wants to give you life. And so you're choosing death by not choosing life. So I think that Capon introduces just a flip the world on its head as to what therapy might be. That mystery is not a going into nothingness, but it is actually discovering being fully alive in the context of the loving grace of one who actually brings that to us. So I think he just opens all kinds of doors that are profoundly therapeutic, profoundly healing. And that's the tradition that I'm both living in and also trying to develop, because I think it's such a rare thing for people to get that. And hence you get books like Philip Reif's The Triumph of the Therapeutic, which is basically a critique against Western, even Christian adoptions of the therapeutic as basically being individualizing, which means basically just furthering the nature of sin, the individual by themselves, fixing themselves.
Yeah, it's therapy does give the idea that you're going to get better, whereas I think Capon is kind of saying you're not, but it's okay.
Well, the question of what better is on the table too.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that when you feel loved, you're better than when you feel like nobody cares about you and you just need to hide in a hole, right? But the better is to be relationally connected, to recognize you are valued, you have worth. I mean, there's something in that is within what we discover in the mystery of Christ. We are not just individuals on a journey of our own, trying to be the captain of our own ship. We are beloved children, and we may have all kinds of judgment on ourselves and from other people. And so all of his readings of the parables of grace, the parables of judgment, all of them strip away all of our readings of the Gospels that turn into moralistic readings of them. And they take us into this, you are profoundly loved. His mention of the Samaritan in this section we looked at here. We are all those who need Jesus to see us and to value us, to pick us up. We are all beat up. Better is you give yourself to one who actually has the capability to take you, embrace you, and bring you into a place where you can be alive and possibly healthy. So
Todd, I'm going to ask you in a minute here to introduce us to Helen. But to introduce folks to Robert Farrar Capon, especially if you haven't had the opportunity to pick up the book yet. Robert Capon was a Episcopal priest. He was the president of an Episcopal seminary at one point. He published a couple of books, one on marriage in the late 60s, early 70s, that made him sort of famous. And I mentioned this because it's relevant to the first chapter. He then had an affair, lost his position, and for a time was in the wilderness and made a living as a food writer. He wrote on food and cooking for the New York Times and other publications. He wrote a book called The Marriage of the Lamb, a kind of theological cookbook. It's one of the best pieces of writing I've ever read. It's very good. And then in a non-church position, he wrote a series of books on the parables, which I also think would be a good spiritual discipline for anyone to pick up on a regular basis. And so it's the parables that kind of returned him to some notoriety in and out of the church. Our friend Fleming Rutledge, who was a colleague of his, she likes to say that Robert Capon took the football that is the gospel and ran out of the stadium with it. And so she thinks she would say that he is an antinomian, that his overemphasis on the gospel of grace leads to something that is no longer Orthodox faith. That's what she would say. And I know Fleming says that as a woman who deeply loves her husband of decades upon decades. Um, and so her own story influences how she reads Capon. And similarly, I think Capon's own story influences how he writes, because he starts with a chapter about adultery. He wrote an entire book using adultery as an illustration of grace. And it's a theme he returns to a lot. And so I think one of the criticisms I might, it'd be interesting for Marty to ponder is there an irony that Robert Capon's presentation of grace over and over and over again is actually a form of self-justification?
One could argue the whole of the Old Testament is based on the theme of adultery, of which Hosea is the most overt, but that the whole story is all about that. And so he's just echoing the Bible in its most succinct modality.
Yeah, so Capon is a beautiful writer. He is a scoundrel and a sinner who I think is able to capture the gospel better than most people.
Just like Paul.
Yeah, and just like Paul, probably his own biography is wrapped up in what he writes. Yep. And so, Todd, all that to say, introduce us to the first chapter entitled Helen.
Yeah. So as Jason mentioned a while ago, and Capon will admit to in the second chapter, is that these characters in these alternating chapters are an amalgam. They're not always the singular, but could be the combination of several conversations, or the extrapolation of, say, a single individual across multiple conversations. He hints at that with regard to Helen, and so it's pretty fascinating. Helen is, if I could say, I think if I were to summarize her, she is looking for validation for her self-justification, and I think that what was fascinating to me was the manner in which that was drawn out in the questions that she was asked, and that if you're uncomfortable with being asked relentlessly, then you'll be uncomfortable with the chapter, because both she relentlessly asks her question looking for the answer she wants to hear. He is relentless in pressing back with his own questions to help her see what it is she's really asking for. I don't know. I listened to Jason's podcast with Josh and Taylor today as well, and then hearing trying to pitch. I'm trying to pitch with Marty's description that the one thing that Capon seems to do with Helen, I'm trying to frame it in that way, that she has a greater estimation of herself and what she's doing, I think. And I think that what Capon's doing is really trying to get to the place where she could see herself as the wounded one on the road, but she seems to have a hard time viewing herself as the wounded one on the road. And for me, I think pastoring for a couple of years, I think that the majority, most recently, have built an edifice for themselves to which they can project feeling much better about themselves than they're willing to admit, and so sound an awful lot like Helen, where I'm just looking for the particular angle to do what either I don't want to decide whether or not I should or shouldn't, or what I'm doing is not really all that bad. And so I think it's yeah, that may be too much into kind of my own kind of reaction to Helen, but I think she is a character who does what, whether it's a fable or not, Luther did, wasn't it? Or Augustine, one of them, had let's make a bargain with God or a promise to God. If you do this, I'll do that. And so she, makes I'll give up this affair if you'll spare my daughter. And then the daughter survives, and it's like, oh well. So it's a very fascinating take too on how he deals with vows, and what kind of God that portrays, what sort of transactions are at work. So anyway, I probably have gone further than just introducing Helen.
May I see if I understand what you're saying, Todd? That you're thinking that Helen came wanting one of two answers. One was, it's really not that bad, Helen. It's life is hard, and it's not that bad what you're doing or what you've done, or it is that bad and you need to clean up your act, and then you'll be right with God.
I think Helen's in a quandary.
Yeah.
And I think Kipon's trying to help her reflect on her thinking through it in light of how she perceives God. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that I want to pin it down as to interpret that as an either or. I think that he does a good job of providing multiple options for how what she's grappling with could be viewed. But essentially, the idea that I make a vow, and now I'm struggling with keeping that vow, and he takes out on, well, let's talk about what God's like. Mm-hmm. And what's God's grace like? What's God's grace do? So to Fleming's, certainly Capon, gets very close to the sun, where everything would be okay. But at the end of the day, he does seem to rely on the magnanimous grace of God as the key to making the kind of decisions where she would have a flourishing life rather than one that's always questioning, has she fulfilled her vow?
Yeah, I was thinking, Marty, as the resident Bart expert here, it's important that Bart flipped the law gospel distinction so that it was gospel and law, and that there's one way of reading the chapter Helen. So it is clear that the law says one thing about what Helen has and is doing, and certainly about bearing true witness too. But if you don't start with the Gospel's depiction of who God is, any vow you make to that God is a vow under false pretenses. You've made a promise to an idol, not the true God. And so there is, I think, pastoral wisdom, and it's more important than whether Helen's behavior is sinful or not sinful, is giving her a correct picture of the true God.
I think that's true. The nature of what Capon wants to do is really not to look at Helen. I think he wants us to ask our own question. Do we think we can condition God into doing something for us? Right up front, he's just taking apart what most people have is, if I am good, then God will love me, then I will go to heaven, and all those other things. So the conditionality of God is really at stake. Helen is kind of a test case to whether or not you go to that. And the question, the mystery of Christ and why we don't get it, is the mystery, is the mystery Christ? Karl Barth's resistance to the book that was written on his theology, The Triumph of Grace, and the theology of Karl Barth, he said, no. It's the triumph of Christ. And so if we say Jesus is sitting there he listens to Helen make a promise, a vow that if her daughter is healed, and he's just going, yeah, there's nothing you can do to make me do anything different. I was always for. You're talking to some other God here, so you're saying no to me because you're not really talking to me because I've already done it. So all your conditional stuff just means you've got some idol. I think Capon really wants to make this clear. You've created an idol, and the first thing we need to do is break the idol that there is some God that you can make these vows and conditions, you'll give something up, and then this God will be different. So first of all, we have to shatter the idols of a conditional God so that we become open to the grace of God. And now we're talking Karl Barth, the unlimited, unconditional, unconditioned of grace of God that will always meet us. And in meeting us, it will transform who we are towards God. And then it's going to have impact on how we relate to others, so that the law is never a set of rules that can be used to condition to God. The law is always just the yes of God towards us. And even in the 10 Commandments, David, the man who has a heart after God, breaks most of them, right? But it's not like he's pointed out for all of the breaking of them, because it was his honesty of knowing the unconditional love of God that made his heart be portrayed that way.
Yeah.
So he's trying to get Helen to see, you're just David, but just wake up to be David and just recognize you've got a decision to make. You're already loved, and you're the woman caught in the act of adultery. And Jesus is just going to say, yep, where are your accusers? I'm not going to accuse you here. That's not my role to make you better morally, though I will say go and sin no more. But what I mean by that is, quit hurting yourself. Quit saying no to love. Live in the light of the value that you've been granted as a human being, given dignity by God. So Capon is just turning over leaf after leaf of our wrong views of God, of grace, of Jesus, and opening us up to what does unconditional love look like? How does that heal us? How does that not make us moralistic? And he does make a point in here. Jesus did not come to make people more moral.
The word he uses instead of conditional is transactional.
Transactional is right.
That's what Troy mentions that in the comments here too. Just kind of fortuitously, earlier today I was reading an essay by Robert Jensen, where he hermeneutics in the life of the church, and he was talking about the importance of preaching the whole Bible with every text, that the Bible is one story, and so that you need to preach each text of the Bible in light of the plot. And I think, and Capon makes a similar point here in this chapter. He says, Scripture is a revelation that takes place over time. Quite a few things were revealed only to be superseded by what comes later. If you were only to read the first 3/4 of the Noah story, for example, you decide that God's prescription for sin is destruction. But if you read the ending, which is the scriptural point of the story, it turns out that mercy, symbolized by the covenant of the rainbow, is God's last real word on sin. And so, I think so. One of the things I thought about reading this again is that Helen has an idol that she has made a transactional vow to. And the fact that she's in a pastoral counseling situation suggests that this is an idol that has been created for her by the preaching that she's been listening to. And so, if the church's proclaimers are not announcing the good news, not preaching the whole Bible, as Jensen says, they're going to create false gods in their hearers' heads that then paint them into a corner when they have transgressed or life isn't working for them.
Well,
Which is the whole story of the Bible.
The temptation to, there's a lot of power in being the one who dispenses and decides what's right and wrong and tells you to get with the program. And that's a very seductive temptation, I think, for the church and for clergy as well.
Mm-hmm.
Any system that replaces a personal relationship is probably just a cage. The nature of of saying, if I was sitting with Helen to say, Helen, let's just talk about, who is this God? Does this God love you unconditionally? Do you love yourself unconditionally here? Do you love your husband unconditionally? Do you love this person with whom you're having an affair? What does love call you to as you listen to what love speaks in each of these? And it's not a rule, it is a listening to the Spirit who brings the mystery into our present listening. And love calls out something that can't be called a moral, but it is love at work. And he says he's going to say more about her too. So it'll be interesting to see the rest of the story.
Yeah. So, so Capon's prose, it's he manages to so like one of the things that like preachers learn in homiletics class is that like the form of the text should determine the form of the sermon. So if you're preaching on a lament psalm, like your sermon should reflect that. And Capon in all of his books manages to write in a way that makes the gospel as fun and outrageous as it should be. And that's just like great gift, I think. And so, he's got this great couple of lines to Helen here. He says, he's talking about God. As a matter of fact, he's a crook. Hold on, I'll go back. But the God we believe in is not a bookkeeper, and he's not respectable. As a matter of fact, he's a crook, and he dies as one to prove it, which is exactly why he's good news for badly bent types like you and me. Do you see what that means? It means that if he's as weird as the gospel says he is, we'd be well advised to stop trying to draw some neat little intellectual or emotional bead on what we think he's like, and just shut up and believe in him, trust in him as he actually reveals himself in Jesus. And that's similar to like how he sets up another book of his called Between Noon and Three, where he's juxtaposing the story of an affair with Paul's letter to the Romans, and he's trying to say that what the Reformation really was the church kind of tearing away all the detritus of tradition and law and discovering this like completely outrageous and ridiculous message that is the gospel, and that if you trust it, it really does change you, but it's not instructions for how you need to be changed. And so it's because it's this like completely gratuitous promise from one lover to the beloved.
Mm-hmm. And Jesus is sitting there in the room as he's talking. And I mean, if there was a crucifix or something, say, that Jesus who's a robber up there, a criminal, he's looking down saying, hey, sister, we're in this together. Right? I mean, there's identification with, there's not the judgment that we often associate with Jesus, that he loves to judge sinners, but there's one of identification with, and I embrace you as you are, not as anybody thinks you should be. The completeness of a language that embraces and demystifies the room of judgment is such a rare thing, but that's what is the masterful thing that the Capon does.
Yeah, and he makes it clear in this conversation with Helen that again, it's more important than getting Helen out of her quote unquote sin is to get her into a right relationship with the true God. And so that those lines I just read, he follows that up by saying to her, but since trusting is the only way to get out of the bad news of the gods into the good news of God in Christ, it's not as hard as you make it sound. As a matter of fact, once you get the hang of it, it's a lark. And Helen balked at that. But isn't that too easy? Isn't that what they call cheap grace? I mean, think about it. I come in here telling you I'm committing adultery, and you practically tell me it doesn't matter. Wouldn't most priests just tell me, however gently, to cut it out? And he replies, maybe. But unfortunately, or fortunately, you've got only one priest here with you now. And besides, that's not what we're talking about. Your question to me was not about adultery, but about keeping a vow to offer up your lover for your daughter's life. What you do about adultery is up to you, which is why my first question was, what do you want to do about it? The question, if I
Mhm.
recall, you did not answer. Yeah, and that reminds me of, like, Gerhard Furdy's, response to people who balk at the gospel. Is like, the question is like, well, what do you want to do in light of the fact that you don't have to do anything? Um, I think, um, and Helen mentions cheap grace, and I think that's the phrase from the only phrase from. I'm convinced that nobody actually reads St. Paul and nobody actually reads Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but they like to throw them around a lot. And what Bonhoeffer meant by cheap grace was not like the idea that Christ is the active agent of salvation. What he meant was, speaking of grace in a way that isn't directly related to the person of Jesus Christ, as a a phenomenon in the world, not a person, as Marty said earlier. So anyway, I just got I was soapboxing. Sorry.
The question of the depth of the love of Christ, he doesn't go if full bore into the depth of love of Christ, but that's what he means. I mean, the mystery is an uncontainable, unfathomable love that ultimately looks down on her and says, why are you making what you're doing so big? Can't you see me and who I am to you? And he's hoping that she'll discover that, I think, which is why he doesn't take it head on. So there is this discovery of mystery, which again, the three forms of mystery, a mystery book, the end, and you get to it, you go, oh, there it is. We didn't have the characters. Some mysteries are just something that you have no idea and you never will. It's a mystery. But to say, this was Bruce Metzger, who was a professor of New Testament, he said, the mystery of Christ is that you discover him and you just keep on discovering. It's a never-ending discovering. And so Capon's mystery here, if he can just start smelling and tasting the never-endingness of the depth of Christ, it becomes a light that overshadows the dark of what it is that Helen is feeling of herself. Another center of the room takes over, and the light and lightness and the possibility of what that brings overshadows the constrainedness and the heaviness and the weight of the human failure. And the whole atmosphere seems to change. That's what mystery does. But people are so focused. Why we don't get it? So focused on us and what's going to happen to us. Right?
Yeah.
Well, and how we can control what's going to happen to us.
Yep.
Yeah, that because he unpacks it throughout the book, and it shows up in his book on the parables as well. That for him, the mystery is that the reconciliation achieved in Jesus Christ is sown into creation itself. That it's the treasure buried in the field being existence. And that's he gets that from Maximus the Confessor, I think. But so he's got this another great line. The good thing, like, I can't remember who I lent this book to, and so I had to get it on Kindle today. And I think Dennis Zulu, who was here with us, I think he has my copy of the book. But the good thing about Kindle. The good thing about Kindle is it shows you the most underlined passages, and so here in Helen's chapter, Capon says, in Jesus' death and resurrection, the whole test-passing, brownie point earning rigmarole of the human race has been canceled for lack of interest on God's part. All he needs from us is a simple yes or no, and off to work he goes. If we say yes to something wrong or no to something right, he will reconcile it all by himself. Not only can he handle it, he's already handled it. He has all our messes fixed in Jesus. It's It is.
All our messes- I'm sorry. He has all our messes fixed in terms of relationship with God. There's still stuff to be sorted out in terms of our the consequences of our actions with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's probably what Fleming means by he takes the football and runs out of the stadium with it.
Yeah.
If we keep saying yes to the love of the heart of the Father, who is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding loving kindness and faithfulness, who forgives sin, iniquity, and transgression, if we keep saying yes to that every choice we make is a yes to love, then in fact the love of Christ works out. If we keep saying no, blocking ourselves away defensively and all that, then we're frustrating it. He finds ways in light of that, but the simplicity of the yes and the no, when our yes is a yes to the one who unconditionally loves us, the nature of what that happens is that we're receiving the gift, and the other way we're just blocking it. And there are some people that block their whole life, and I say those people live in hell here and now. You see them, all they do is shut people out, injure people, but they keep receiving life day by day and people to love them. In the end, Christ will say, "For you, I have died." In the end, the yes of Jesus, even for them, is there. But every day is an invitation of the love to say yes that never stops presenting itself to us. Can I love you here? Can I love you today? Can I love you in this place?
But don't we mostly
What's that?
don't we mostly say yes and no? I mean, we
every
don't.
yes has a no within it, and every no has a yes. When you say
yeah,
yes to
I know,
one,
but I mean,
It's very dialectic of you.
we're not. I mean, what I'm trying to say is, it feels the way you're putting it, Marty, a little bit conditional to me. If I say yes, then we'll get on with this thing. And even when I say no, God is still saying yes, is
that's true.
what I think is the
Yeah.
good news.
But you just talk about the daily living out of it. I mean, if you say yes to your wife and you're saying no to all other women, there's a connection in that. If you say no to her, there's going to be a consequence. She will hear the no. But even there, if you keep saying, yes, I love you to her, and yes, pursuing love, there is a sense in which we can resist the love of God and resist the love of others. It's never conditional, it's consequential. Unconditional love always has consequences to it. So when you love somebody and they love you back, it's not that you earned that love, it's just the consequence of loving is that love is the act of persons who give themselves to one another. And when we shut off from God or one another, there are consequences. The love doesn't go away. The unconditional love's still there. That's Capon's. That's why he can make all these statements. The unconditional love is still there for you, Helen. There are consequences. You're sitting here in this office. That's the consequence. The love's not going to go away, but you're going to get to deal with it. And the choices you make, you can still live with it within that unconditional love. And the consequences will come whatever way you go, but they're going to work out when you choose to do what really works for you, loving yourself, saying yes to something you can say yes to, and to anybody else involved. Then the nature of your quandary will at least live within the unconditional love of God, so that that's no longer the issue. It's just, are you going to let yourself be loved and act like you're loved and love others like that? But it's all unconditional love for Capon.
And I keep wanting to push back against the running out of the stadium with the football, because there is that point in the narrative that he constructs that she keeps returning to. But I came and you've not yet told me that I should stop doing this. And he said, "Well, you already know the answer to that." I hear that resonant, and I think he even made the call back, to Jesus' own words. I didn't come to condemn the world. I mean, we already know the consequences of the no. And so right here, there's more of a pretension that, will it all be okay if I keep saying no? And he's like, I've already told you, here are 5 possibilities. You're going to have to go back and rethink about this God that you've made a vow to. And as a result of what you decide or what's been revealed about who that God is or was, or what he should be like rather than what you've made him to be, ought to inform now what yes you say yes to and what no you say no to. So I just don't know that I see him.
The football illustration is tricky. though,
Katie
because
bar the
there are-
door. I just don't see him Katie bar the door here. I mean, and maybe, yeah. Anyway,
There's rules in football, and so if you leave the stadium, you're saying I'm going to use this football for something else, right? And so if we keep the football illustration too much in place, we just switch from one system of rules to another system of rules. You're just breaking the rules. Capon's saying the rule is, hell, no matter what you do, this God who you thought you could condition, he already loves you, never will. The only rule is unconditional love. So whatever you do, you're going to be loved. That rule cannot be broken. Right? Now there are things, there are choices you're going to make. And God's not going to love you any less or more. Probably there are going to be consequences in your life. And you know what you're going to do. You're already doing it. The fact that you're choosing it says that if you're choosing it, you're probably going to keep choosing it. Mm-hmm. God will not love you any less, and your daughter's not going to get sick again. Right. So get off of that and figure out what you're going to do.
Right.
But you're in the stadium of love. Play.
Right.
Live as though you're abandonedly living in the context of love. Make a choice.
In the chat, Troy has a question that may be worth exploring here. Is Helen asking for forgiveness or justification?
It is a good question.
That was a little bit what I was trying to ask you, Todd, in the initial your first.
Yeah.
You see yourself as somebody who needs mercy and grace, or does she want justification?
I mean, my first impulse is to say she's looking for justification. That's my first impulse, since she never answers the question, and she dances around the question, and he keeps persisting, and she's startled by the very idea that she could be forgiven. So maybe what we're going to hear more about Helen is that she arrives at the place where she discovers she's forgiven. But I think her position, I think Helen is looking for justification. And at this particular point, I think she's looking for self-justification. She's concocted this idol we've described. And by that pattern, am I justified in what I'm doing based on the pattern? Oh, but I got this problem. I made this vow, and now I'm stuck in this pattern or this prison that Marty was describing. And now how do I get out? And he keeps saying, you're asking the wrong question. And you've not answered the right one.
You're already out of the prison. What are you going to do now?
Out of the prison with God. She wants to mitigate the consequences of being stuck between daughter, lover, and husband, right? How do I come out with the best consequences? And as Kelly said, those who say yes do not have a life on easy street. There's no easy yes here. And she's wanting to be told by somebody else because all she can see is the consequences of loss. If she tells the husband, there goes her lover. If she tells the lover, there goes the husband. The daughter at some level is not the key player here. It's between those two emotionally, but she really wants to have the least damage possible and to tell nobody anything. Maybe the easiest way just to continue living, quote unquote, living the lie. Maybe the yes that Capon's saying, that's a choice. Just say
and he
yes
does say that's a choice. Right.
It is a choice, yeah. And there's something in our morality mode that wants to say you're lying to one or the other, your husband or your lover. And the fact that Christ dies for us while we're all sinners and that we think we have this moral mode where everything's fine, it's probably because we're just not recognizing how much of the time we're sinners in many more ways than we notice. For her, it's just right in front of her face.
Lori follows up Troy's question by saying that was her question too, and then says, seems like she wants permission.
Right.
Yeah, I was thinking, Tony. I mean, so Capon is basing this on snatches of memories of conversations he's had, and so I'm just thinking of my own pastoral experience. I do think it's absolutely true that a lot of people who ask to speak to a pastor, or no, who have asked to speak to me in that capacity, do have some sort of transactional understanding of the faith in their head, and it's gotten them crosswise. But also in my experience, when a married couple are foundered against the rocks and they ask to meet with me rather than say Marty, if they're paying the money to meet with Marty, they really want to make it work. And in almost 100% of the times when a married couple asks to meet with me for free, it's the husband. It's always the husband is wanting to check all the boxes so he can tell himself that he did everything he could to save the marriage that he had already flipped the switch on.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
it's almost always about self-justification and
Almost
not
always. Yeah. Almost always. Yeah. I think incidentally, and this is not a gratuitous nod to the host, but you can, in thinking about this, as I read about Helen, I couldn't help but think of your book, Living in Sin. It is
available on Amazon.
Of yours. Absolutely. It is Capon-esque for sure. So if y'all want a more contemporary rendition of what is going on in this book, you'll find it there in very good fashion. But it reminded me, it called back when I started reading Helen. I'm going,
okay,
Jason wrote this book.
Yeah, so I mean, but that's a good point. Not the self-promotional part of it is embarrassing, but it's because so like I write a book about cancer, whose title I now hate, and they asked me to do one about marriage, and I said yes, like without really thinking about it, and then I'm just like, thinking about my own marriage, and I was like, well, shit, like I don't have any advice to give anybody. Like I didn't take the wisdom class in seminary. Like I don't know. Like, and so I was like, no, I don't have. There is no law I can give you to make life better or holier or easier. And so I tried to resist the instructions as much as possible.
Yeah.
I would point out the second chapter that we were going to look at is the mystery and guilt. So to say he's pairing these chapters, I think.
Yes.
And so, I describe guilt as when we are right about ourselves being wrong. Shame is being right about other people being right about us being wrong. And so that self-judgment that Helen is dealing with at some level is living in the place of the human as judge, which is a major problem. Blame, by the way, is us being right about other people being wrong. So I always begin with new couples saying, in this place, everybody gets an opinion and nobody gets to be right, including me. And I'm trying to subvert exactly this thing. We're not gonna pay attention to people's guilt and shame and who blames who. That's not going to be part of our conversation here. And it's doing, I think, what Capon is wanting to do is to recognize that is the mode of our being. Somebody's got to be right, and we need to make the right decision, and somebody's going to be wrong, and somebody's going to give me the answer, and we'll make it all work out. And so it's a whole nother playing field. And maybe this is the leaving the stadium of the football, a whole nother playing field when the only question is, what is the loving thing to do here? And that I think is the nature of the love of Christ and the cross, which most of us think is about Jesus being making our no, dealing with the no instead of it being the profound yes of God. God says yes, even while we're all Helens and all the other people he's going to write in this book. He's already saying, yes, I love you to death and to life again. And I'm not going to sit here and judge every one of your sins for you. Sorry. All I'm going to do is make sure that you never have a question about the nature of my relationship with you and whether I'm right making you wrong so that you need to live in shame or guilt or anything.
You're related to the second chapter. Capon has a very good few lines here, and this is his response to misconceiving ministry as a helping profession. And he says, so he's addressing the mistake of someone who thinks, and this could be a church person as much as a pastor that Helen would confide in, thinking that it's their job to get Helen back on the right track. And he says, the problem with that approach has a number of very large booby traps in it. One is that it buries the gospel. Jesus didn't say he came to judge sinners or even to turn them into non-sinners. He came to save them. And the rest of the New Testament makes it quite clear that his salvation works by grace through faith, not by frightening people into getting their act together. A second booby trap of the approach is that it puts all the people who don't, can't, or won't get their act together, and that includes all of us in one department or another, outside the reach of God's forgiveness in Christ, a forgiveness presumably offered to the whole world, sin notwithstanding. While we were still sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. But the third booby trap is potentially the most gospel obscuring of all. Theology, whether dogmatic or moral or ascetic or whatever, is fundamentally systematic thought about what you believe. Therefore, it is only as good as the system you invent to do your thinking with.
Which I always say, unless your theology is letting God talk, right? If it's us talking about God, it's all he said. And there's a track, and whatever track you choose, it's a track of legalism and condition and all that. The only theology that's adequate that Capon's taking us towards is a God who speaks, and he always says, I love you no matter what. Next.
Yeah, and that in that essay of Jensen's that I mentioned earlier, like his point about preaching the whole Bible is that if you're not doing that, whatever you say in your sermon, it is not what God once said. So it's, yeah.
Surprising God doesn't strike more of us down.
Well, it's good to see you guys again.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
So
Enjoyed.
What do you want us to focus on next week, Jason?
I mean, I think to the extent that we can accomplish it, doing these chapters as pairs makes the most sense.
Sure. Okay.
I believe in good pairing, wine pairing.
Yep. And before we go, Tony, a listener, a viewer, a participant here, because it's been a while since you have joined us, asked for you to introduce yourself to us.
Let's see. I'm a United Church of Christ pastor, author of a bunch of books. I'm semi-retired. Currently, I'm the project manager for a United Church of Canada project called Reimagining Theological Education. Served 4 churches over 30 years and then taught and wrote and consulted and live in Seattle. Have 3 kids and 6 grandkids. And right now we have our daughter's dog, Georgie, with us. Who's she's in Hawaii and she left the dog with us for 2 months. And my wife said, I'll miss the dog when she's gone, but one of my daughters-in-law says she's a Velcro dog. She's like constantly at my side. She's a little irritated now because I closed the door and she wants to be here and convey grace.
Well, one of my 2 dogs is laying at my feet, having eaten some of his own poo earlier and a pair of my underwear. So,
Yeah, well,
so.
they look so nice.
Well, thank you, Tony. You know, and one of the things we have to do as I, advance in age is you need to give me the advice on how you get the retirement gigs that you get.
Well, I think they'll be coming your way, Jason, but you might have to soften that challenger in your face thing.
You're telling him to soften his Enneagram 8, are you?
Yeah, maybe he needs to do more CPE. I don't know.
Maybe I need to meet with Marty.
Yeah.
Every week.
Maybe Marty's cheaper than my current therapist, so that might work.
He's definitely cheaper than your monthly medication, but he probably
Yes.
yeah.
All right. Well,
Okay.
we'll talk about Michael next week.
Okay.
Okay. Great
Good.
to be with you.
All right.